So density is really interesting. I mean, I know London, everything's high density, but there is, 90% of new dwellings are not high density. They are very, very low density that are being built. I find that a kind of extraordinary figure. And they look very much like this. These are densities of probably about 25 dwellings per hectare, maybe even less. By all the major volume house builders are doing stuff like this, or it looks very similar. And just to finish off, I have a big problem with this kind of development, and I try and explain to people why. I'm heckled a lot by volume house builders. I'm told that this is what people want. I'm a member of the Quality of Life board, and we're doing a kind of survey at the moment to try and find out the kind of housing that's been the most successful in COVID times. But I'd be really interested what people in these houses say about how they feel about their community, because I think one of the things that come into their own at the moment is streets. So just a quick, why is this a problem? The houses I don't like them. The architecture, I don't like it, but it's not the thing I have the most issue with. Just to kind of try and explain it visually. So we took this, we just Googled new housing aerial, and this is one of the first images that came up, and is by one of the major volume house builders. I have no idea where it is. It's just it was at a good angle that we could actually do some kind of relatively scientific analysis on it. So we drew over it basically. So those are the houses. As architects, this is the bit we control, really. That people get really stuck into the houses, but we don't have that much control on everything outside. The parking, the size of the roads, the overlooking distances, all these are set by people, and so those are the kind of things that dictate this kind of layout. Those are the green spaces. Some of them are back gardens. A lot of them are kind of amorphous bits of leftover space that have got grass on them. Those are the trees. Now these are the bits, or these are the pavements. These are the places that, as a pedestrian, you have priority. You can wander around and not have to look out for a car. And this is where cars have priority in the scheme. And this is this is really the kind of crux of the problem we're facing. We're designing around car use and car ownership. The majority of new places are being built where car dependency is an absolute, because they're nowhere near any of the public service facilities and all that kind of stuff. So the next slide is everything else. That's the bus stops, the playgrounds, the schools, the shops in this particular scheme. And we tried to reimagine this, because I don't think it's really the houses, as I said, don't like them, but that's what people want. Fair enough. But if we started to think about giving pedestrians priority, putting kind of leisure, and making making roads do the hard work, we could have a very different way of planning. And that's what I would hope that people would have noticed during the lockdown, that suddenly we got our streets back. And I had got friends' kids who learned to ride a bicycle finally, and that's, I don't know, maybe that's my hope for the future. Well, I have a constant frustration with the things that the things in planning. So I'm putting it to the planners here, that seem to prevent the kind of scheme that we did at Goldsmith Street, which is a relatively high density housing scheme. So overlooking distances, 21 metres outside London. Where does that come from? It implies privacy, but actually people are more concerned about acoustic privacy than visual privacy, because they can put nets up or affect that. So that's set in stone in most local authorities. Very, very difficult to challenge. What that does is set out a suburban street with a 5 metre wide road where cars can go as quickly as possible, and it's very difficult to challenge that. Highways, that's another thing. Parking requirements, all these things lead to a very particular density, and that's why we see them coming up all over the country. So I think we need to challenge the planning rules. Why can't we slow traffic down? What's wrong with making it go a bit slower in residential neighbourhoods. We've done so much because of COVID, but if you look at the statistics of deaths from pollution, of which cars contribute, 40,000 deaths immediately attributed to pollution, 26,000 deaths and serious injuries due to road traffic accidents involving vehicles. That's every year. So I think one of them stumbling blocks is that planning is very weighted towards cars going as quickly as possible from A to B, and not towards prioritising pedestrians and cyclists.
Annalie, can I just come back straight onto that? I think there's also kind of a nervousness, particularly outside urban areas, about densities and the perception that if you're in a village, if you're somewhere in rural areas, it has to be low density, although it's probably exactly the opposite of what villages and countryside are. I mean, I was just wondering, could you just, because I know you have worked on a really good study, just highlight that or put it into the chat or something, because I think it's really valuable for other people.
So this density that we tend to work with outside London in any place of about 25 dwellings per hectare is a density, it's a suburban density that came about because of car ownership, with the development of the suburbs, the ease of access. So it's not something that we see in our villages or cities. It came in, it kind of really mushroomed in the 1950s because of this supposed freedom that cars would give to our lives, and it resulted in a massive sprawl, massive land take, which isn't the kind of housing that actually was there before. And my frustration is that this seems to have been accepted as the norm for all new development generally. I mean, and 90% or something is at those kind of densities, and nowhere near any public transport. So we are creating places where you need a car rather than putting new development where you don't need them. As architects, we just don't have much power. We are able to do a demonstration of how you might do things differently on the site. So that's what we've done. I'd love to have more power and listen to, but we can show things can be different. And hopefully what Goldsmith Street's shown is that you can build really sustainable housing to a quite tight budget and challenge overlooking distances. Although we did have to deal with them on a case by case. We weren't able to kind of get rid of the 21 meters. We had to face all the habitable rooms the same way, so they weren't looking into each other. But it can be done. It doesn't look. But we had challenges at the design review panel at the width of our street. Everyone thought it was just too narrow, and it's not when you go there. It really isn't. So
thank you for that. I mean, I've got one other raised hand, and to be honest, I can only see a raised hand and an absolutely amazing bookshelf in the background, and a white shirt. So I think you know who I mean.
There's quite a lot to say about this, isn't there? I'll try and keep it to sort of three things that I think are quite structural. And I come from the point of view as an urban designer working in a local authority planning department. And I've gone through planning policy as well as development management. If you're trying to get through a local plan and you're trying to be ambitious, you tend to find that your ambitions are thwarted as soon as you get anywhere near the completion of that plan. And it doesn't matter about the ambitions of your local populace. It will come down to the inspector finding your plan sound or unsound. So we can try really hard to put in really good environmental standards or higher densities, but that will be challenged really heavily by developers. And then we will be found unsound, and we will have to take it out of the plan or just put it in as it would be a really nice thing if you did this or that. So that's the first point. The second point is that when we come down to the way in which land operates, at policy level, when you're trying to allocate where houses are built, that's the first issue, because you cannot have a sustainable development if it's in the wrong place, because you can't get to the places where you need to go. It's not served by the right roads. But what you've actually done is followed the ambitions of a local landowner who wants to put his land forward. So you have a call for sites. You go out and you say to everybody in your local area, who wants to have housing put on their land? And then you choose from those areas of land, which is why you get these insanely shaped developments which have corners, because they're built in fields. Well, that's just daft. So you have land which is being put forward for housing, so you are inevitably going to get housing in the wrong place as you try to get the right numbers. And then the final point, I'll try and keep it short, is that we're operating in an unregulated land market. So when we're talking about house prices and affordability and all of that sort of thing, you know, A, it's in the wrong place, and then B, you've got this affordability issue, which comes down to the fact that land goes to the highest bidder. So of course it's going to be expensive. The house is almost immaterial. The land is everything. The cost of building a house is a really vanishingly small percentage in terms of the proportion to land value. So we have so many parts of the system that are broken, and to deal with all of this, and I really do get the point that we need this wider conversation, but it's the very highest levels of leadership that need to address this, because we're looking at primary legislation that changes any of these issues. You cannot get anywhere with a planning system that has not been addressed through primary legislation, the way in which it works. And I would imagine that what we're going to see is further deregulation, which will actually make things even worse. I stand to be corrected on that. It might make it all better, I don't know. But my guess is that it's not going to get a whole lot better. So we'll wait and see, and I'll just stick to those three for now.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm an architect and planner, so I guess you can blame me. But it's curious, this 21 meter distance, which is rather arcane. I believe it came about because you're not supposed to be able to see certain parts of the human anatomy at that distance, which is a bit daft. That notwithstanding, it is interesting to see how suburban housing has developed, and gardens have squeezed. You would have had much longer gardens than 10 meters or 10.5 meters at one time. And I think for family housing, people want gardens. I think 10 meters equaling 20 back to back is actually reasonable. And it's also my experience that the kind of densities you get from that, even allowing for cars, they can be such that you can provide local facilities. If they're well designed so that people can walk, they will work at those densities. But developers are damned if they're going to produce them. And we are not insistent, I think, enough as planners on genuine mixed development with community facilities. The other trend I think is happening is a lot of local authorities, including Medway, where I used to work, have caught on to high density. They see it politically as being a good thing because it means less development in the countryside, which is very difficult for them. So you might say that's a good thing, except that an awful lot of planners outside London don't know what to insist on in high density development, and developers are willing to exploit that. And you are seeing some appallingly designed high density developments with single aspects, hotel type corridors, lack of private outdoor space, and the authorities are very, very happy to push that forward. And I think we need a real wider education process, actually. London, we're used to this kind of thing, but if it's going to happen elsewhere, then the challenges of designing at reasonable densities and getting decent living conditions is really important to make planners and developers aware of that outside London.
Thank you, Martin. Shall we go straight to Caroline, and then we can pick it up with the panel again?
Hello, thank you. Yeah, I'm also a planner, so I just wanted to respond to that point about the 21 metre distances. I work for the Ebbsfleet Development Corporation, so we are obviously a new garden city and trying to instill all these ideas about more sustainable living and trying to embed more ambitious approaches. We are in a bit of a unique position where obviously we are not the plan making authority, so we have to adopt the policies that apply to the geographic area, being either Dartford or Gravesham, depending where the site falls. So it's a bit of a complicated balance in that respect. there is, I mean, I personally haven't seen a huge amount of 21 metre distances being applied so rigorously. And I think it is a case of, you know, balancing that good design in what is appropriate for the type of density that's being applied in any particular case. So there might be, I think, an argument about policy generally needing to kind of catch up with this forward thinking about what are, you know, is there a need for appropriate sizes to be set, and trying to avoid particularly the highway-led design. We're trying to, you know, look at more ambitious approaches, but what I wanted to sort of come back on was particularly the struggle that we have is a lot of the feedback from house builders. We're dealing with sort of major house builders, and the perception, particularly from sales teams, about what people want to buy, and therefore the number of car parking spaces that they want to see associated with particular house types. So that has been quite a challenge for us to try and change that approach to a very car-driven, you know, layout. So I think, you know, it'll be interesting to see what the effects of COVID and the sort of perception of people's attitudes to houses and what they want as a result of the sort of reflection on what we want our homes to do now.
Okay, thank you.
Just 2 quick points. One is, I think that we have been witnessing, or we are witnessing, a major change in the composition of urban areas, because, and we can anticipate, everybody's talking about it, you know, the mixed use areas, the high streets are reducing, and maybe the COVID will accelerate that further, both in terms of retail and also workspace. The offices will be smaller. They will assume that people work from home a lot more, which means that the residential areas, the residential neighborhoods, will really be our social spaces as well. Will no longer be simply just the private street and from which you go to a common or a shared high street, which is the character or is the identity of the neighborhood. That has happened in villages already, in the smaller villages across the countryside that have lost a lot of retail, and the high streets are now mainly residential. Still, they have character. Still, they are identifiable high streets, but they are primarily or nearly entirely residential. So that is one trend that we have to bear in mind, that changes the composition, the fabric of neighborhoods, that this change in the percentage of mixed use. The second point that I wanted to make was just in response to some of the discussions that happened before. I think we cannot change until we develop and until the rules for transport assessments change, until we do transport assessment differently. Of course, we are designing for cars, because the whole purpose of a transport assessment is to demonstrate that there is no congestions anywhere, which means that prioritizes cars, and which means that there is no more funding for doing anything else. So the first thing to do is to change the way planning applications are judged. So these were my 2 points.
Yeah, but thank you for that. I mean, also that you mentioned transport assessments. I mean, they're kind of like personal hatred of mine. So, I mean, it's something certainly I think and the UDG are trying to tackle, because they often are, well, leading us in the wrong direction, really. So where was I? I think we have 2 raised hands. One is from Catherine. Do you want to pose your question or your comment?
Yes, I wanted to ask the panelists, with some wonderful ideas and positivity coming through, how do you hope to reconcile this with the current government plans to do away with restrictions and create a free-for-all in terms of the easiest route? Because if anything is more difficult than doing what you've always done, it's doing something different, even if it makes all the sense which you've demonstrated in some of your illustrations. So in terms of practical application of all the positive thinking, how will you in your different roles be going about seeing if any of that can happen. Thank you.
I can't see Irina and Hilary anymore on my screen. Oh, there you are in the top. Yep, Hilary, do you want to go first?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question and related to Katja's question and Annalie's challenge to planners. How are you going to do this? I think the problem is one of leadership, and so I don't mean this to sound negative about planners at all, but there lots of people, planners, are trying to do what they think the system wants them to do, and they are trying to to stop the worst happening of everything. The whole thing about concern about overlooking distances. But we need some strong leadership that says places are what's important and people's what's important. I'm not seeing any of that coming. Well, it's not clear to me what this fabled new planning system will quite be, and whether its focus is that or whether it is, as you say, a free-for-all. Some days I think it's about having more of a European-style system, and other days I think it's just about who makes the most money out of things. So I'm really not. It's not clear to me. But I think. In the same way that the last planning white paper started with a load of ideas and only very few of them ended up through the filter, I suspect the same will happen this time, and that the kind of wholesale change needed if to do something different is not what will happen. But we have got to really think about what the planning system is trying to do, because it's got very complicated, and as Annalie says, sometimes isn't leading to the sort of outcomes that even those planners working on the projects would want. So we've quite often got to odd outcomes that we don't necessarily want, and we've got to really think, why are we doing it, and what's our core purpose? And I think we have to start with the leadership and the documents that tell us where to go next. And I think that it comes down to the fact that we have sort of broken our ability to have these big discussions and to have the discussion with people about whether. Everyone says, oh, well, I'd like the new development to look like that little lovely market town over there. And then, but I would like three car spaces per house, and they need to be in the front. They can't be on street. And actually those things are incompatible, but it's very difficult to say to people, actually, you're asking for two things that can't fit together. But we need to have those debates and those discussions at leadership level. Our leaders need to be engaging with them, and we need to be pushing them to be saying, okay, I don't mean realistic as in with low ambition, but realistic as in let's tell people and share information and work with people to say, okay, we can't do all of these things. They're mutually incompatible. We've got to decide what we want. We can't have, and there's some really good stuff in the chat here, we can't let highways decisions be made in one silo, planning decisions be made in another silo, and then housing standards and various things over there. We've got to somehow bring this together, and we are getting more disaggregated. These decisions are all being more separate, and we might decide that that's an intentional choice by some people to do that, or we might decide that it's an incidental outcome of the system that we have. But the system does need some change.
Absolutely, yes. So is there anything you want to kind of like, the key message we have to take away or into the next stage of the discussion? Any challenges you want to set out, the kind of the group of urban designers, planners, architects that you have in front of you?
Well, I think I'm very happy just to say very briefly, I mean, I set out the things I think we need to change, but we have to be campaigning at high level. We need to be not messing around in some of the detail and discussing and arguing that. We've got to be campaigning for high level change, for kind of people focused places and design, and those have got to be the highest priority. In theory, we have an MPPF that prioritizes environmental considerations. I really don't think it is effective in doing that at all, and we need to make sure we don't just replace one seemingly good idea with another one that actually isn't effective. So we've got to be pushing change up.
Yeah, thank you. That's only a very small challenge to this group.
I really wish I knew how to make change. But I think from our point of view, obviously the Velocity thing, which I haven't talked about, sometimes it's just about pushing an idea and seeing if someone will be brave enough to do something different. And, that's what we need, not to be told, oh, this is what people want, this sells. we need one of the volume house bills, it's a shame gone, but to really just show that actually people might want to live differently. I don't believe everyone wants to live in those kind of houses, but that's what I'm told. So we need someone to take it on board. And I think, we do work with Urban Splash. They completely changed the Manchester city centre. The idea of loft living, they took it to there and they changed. It takes some brave people who just throw the rules away and try to make it work. Unfortunately, I don't think they're the people who are making the decisions. But there are people out there, and we just need to find them and do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think there's a very valid point in there in terms of choice, because I think sometimes people think, well, that is the only thing that's on the market, the only thing they want. So it's kind of giving people choice, demonstrating different environments, because they might want to choose something different, but it might not be there.
The only reason people want a house with 3 parking spaces is because it's nowhere near anything, and there's that is what is being built. That's what they get. They're going to want 3 parking spaces because their daily lives are going to be a nightmare without cars, because there's no shops, there's nothing else. And I fail to understand how that's okay to build massive housing estates without any facilities for people.
Yeah. And I mean, that comes back to the kind of previous comment, the strategic planning, strategic design of, locating the right developments in the right places. And I mean, kind of, I can say probably now, watch this space, because we have been talking about doing one of these sessions about the strategic design, strategic planning of how can we actually make sure that places are designed and planned in the right places, and it's not just the place with the least resistant in the middle of a green field, but is actually kind of has facilities around it and is connected with public transport as well, and not just roads. So that's something to mark on for the future. Any other comments? Any burning? Annalie, yes?
I do think that that something like a car, the building in someone's field nowhere near any facilities, because that's what someone's put their land forward. The impact on society for that decision in terms of, pollution, CO2 footprint, and the densities, the amount of land that eats up, and the loss of biodiversity. I just think we need a carbon tax and a biodiversity tax, because I just don't see, we're all paying the price for that kind of development in the kind of levels of pollution, loss of biodiversity, and that's the way to do it. Tax.
Yeah, I mean, there was somebody, and I might put somebody really on the spot here, but I can read out the comment as well. A comment from Mark Pearson, and I don't know if they want to restate what they've written, but it's all about strategic land that is allocated, needs to be transferred to public ownership and master planned before inviting the developers back in to do the buildings. Land ownership should get merely a reasonable compensation for using their assets. So I think that is one of the big issues we need to address as well, that the land ownership, it's not the landowner who needs to kind of get all the benefit. It is actually kind of our communities and our society that should get the benefit of allocating land.